Name of the boss seems confusing. That's normal, that's because it's made of 3 different bosses. The order in which you kill the bosses is what causes the fight to either be normal mode or hard mode, with an in-between, medium mode, that yields no bonus loot but grants you a quest item that otherwise requires hard mode. Full mechanics rundown: each boss is healed to full if another dies. Multi-dotting and cleaving is thus entirely useless, except maybe the case of Affliction's eradication uptime. The 3 bosses are Steelbreaker, Giant, Runemaster Molgheim, Vrykul, and Stormhealer Brundir, Dwarf. For normal mode, they will die in this order, big to small. Phase 1: all bosses are alive and this phase ends when Steelbreaker dies. The fight may be either 2 tanked or 3 tanked. Steelbreaker will cast Fusion Punch at his current tank, dealing high nature damage and applying a lethal nature dot. A Paladin tank may dispel it on himself instantly, other tanks will rely on a healer or a Fellhunter dispelling it instantly. Runemaster Molgheim casts Shield of Runes, which should be spell stolen instantly as much as possible. Not a big deal in normal mode. He also casts Rune of Power under either of his 2 fellow bosses, dropping a large blue AoE. Any boss or player in this AoE deals plus 50% damage. It is thus vital to move the bosses out of it and have as many DPS in it as possible. Stormhealer Brundir casts interruptible lightning bolts and chain lightning, of no danger. He can also be stunned in this phase, and this one only. He will be tanked far away from the raid as he also casts Overload, a long cast that causes lethal AoE damage to anyone nearby. If his tank and the rest of the raid are positioned properly, this should be no issue, but it must be paid attention to. After watching classic WotLK, apparently Overload is non-lethal. You can tank it, as DPS and anyone. You'll be stunned, but that's better than moving. Ask your raid leader just to be sure. Phase 2: Steelbreaker dies but the 2 other bosses retain all their spells, deal increased damage, and gain new abilities. Runemaster Molgheim will now be the DPS target. He still casts Shield of Runes, which should be spell stolen or dispelled instantly when he completes the cast. If not dispelled, Runemaster Molgheim will deal plus 50% damage for a while. This is manageable in normal mode. He will still cast Rune of Power and DPS must make use of the zone. Runemaster Molgheim is now able to cast Rune of Death. This drops a very large green AoE at the current location of a player. The zone inflicts heavy shadow damage every second to any player in it. Thus, if the cooldown of this ability is known on DBM, it will be called to spread around and stay clear of the Rune of Power. When the Rune of Death drops, all players should move out of it and then move back to the Rune of Power to DPS. Stormhealer Brundir is now able to cast Lightning Whirl. This is an interruptible channel which, every few seconds, will deal near lethal nature damage to a few random raid members. This should be interrupted near instantly. If Brundir's tank is Paladin or Druid, it will be required that a DPS, Shaman, DK, War, Rogue, will stay on Brundir for interrupts, in spite of his DPS being wasted on him. Phase 2 ends when Runemaster Molgheim dies. If possible, DPS will halt until Molgheim drops a fresh Rune of Power. They have a limited duration, in order to end the fight faster thanks to the increased DPS. Phase 3 only Stormhealer Brundir remains, dealing further increased damage with all his mechanics. He will reflect some damage when hit by auto attacks, but it is easily healed through. His melee swings are also still close to negligible. Now that all DPS are focusing on him, his Lightning Whirl should be interrupted instantly by DKs and enhancement shamans. His new ability is Lightning Tendrils and will be cast regularly during the fight. When he does, he will fly up in the air, while remaining targetable for ranged DPS, and deal extremely heavy damage to anyone close to him. He is able to move during this ability and will randomly chase players at high speed. It is preferable for the chased player to actually stand still and pray for heals rather than risk running away from healers or running into friends. Losing players is acceptable as long as Brundir eventually dies to DPS. He will almost always cast a Lightning Whirl when ending his Lightning Tendrils, usually resetting threat in the process. Thus ranged DPS should be on the lookout for interrupts as melees will not be in range yet. He still casts Overload, and he often uses Lightning Whirl after one. Essentials: tanks move bosses out of Runes of Power, blue, while ensuring melee DPS can sit in the rune and still reach your boss if he's the kill target. You too can be a Rune of Death target. Do not stay near runes of power during those timings. Make sure you keep facing your tanked boss, S, while moving in this fight. Do not attempt to tank through Stormcaller Brundir's overload unless a DK tank with AMS up. Interrupt Stormcaller Brundir if your class allows it. Self-dispel fusion punches, Steelbreaker, if Paladin. Essentials, healers. This fight is mostly tank damage. Make sure they're all topped off accordingly depending on which boss, S, they're tanking. Rune of Power doesn't do much for you but gives you an idea of where the raid should be. Holy Paladins must DSAC and or Shadow AM the Runes of Deaths, and DSAC the Lightning Tendrils. Be mindful of overloads from Stormcaller Brundir. Essentials. DPS don't DPS the wrong target, MMMMH. Stay clear from Runes of Power when called to. In Phase 2, if Stormcaller Brundir casts something then you might as well interrupt it, but Lightning Whirl is the only lethal one. Run away from his overloads.